Hello, I'm Shawn Murphy, and this is Data That Moves Us, the podcast from the Limb Loss and Preservation Registry. We explore how high quality data translates into improved outcomes that drive better care for people living with limb loss and limb difference. Today, we're joined by Pat Tarnowski from OneStep, an organization dedicated to empowering individuals with limb loss and healthcare professionals with gait and mobility insights to act sooner, treat smarter, and stay connected through every step. In this episode, we'll discuss how programs like OneStep are redefining recovery beyond the clinic, the role of gait in long-term outcomes, and how patient-centered data can better reflect the full journey of those living with limb loss.
Pat, please introduce yourself and a little about your journey to create OneStep.
I'm Pat Tarnowski. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at OneStep and a physical therapist by background. I have a very fortunate professional career in that I began many years ago treating patients and loved all of what we do in the therapy space. My area of specialty and focus was in foot and ankle and lower extremity biomechanics. I became boarded as a specialist in sports physical therapy, so got to work with a lot of athletes and teams. But after doing it for, 10 plus years, I realized that I really like the business of our business. Still love the science, still love the work of the Physical Therapy Association and all of the adjacencies, but had the opportunity to take a look at the rehab world through a different lens. So I was fortunate enough to be able to move into the medical device world. It was a company that we focused primarily on rehabilitation, orthopedic surgery, and in the prosthetic space. So got to use the knowledge I gained over the years of treating patients, but then being able to look at it through the lens of how devices can have positive impact and how providers think about devices. So I spent many years on it, or touched all parts of the medical device world, whether it was on product development or marketing or working in a lobbying effort, and also an awful lot of like the business side, M&A activity. And from there, had the opportunity to then move into another part of the health world ecosystem by leading the rehab service line for a very large health system here in Minnesota. So we had about 1,700 members of our team: PT, OT, speech, physiatry, nursing, rehab psychology, social work, did all of their medical rehab in 11 hospitals and 40 outpatient locations. And so we really worked from pediatrics to geriatrics and everything in between, as well as folks with limb loss and certainly with prosthetic needs. It's a different lens, the way that hospital administrators think about patient care, they think about payer relationships, they think about provider relationships, and then think, what are the things that drive their business? Readmissions, lengths of stay, total cost of care. It was a tremendous opportunity to learn, and we grew the rehabilitation service line across this large health system. I took a little bit of a turn, spent some time in the venture world, and was lucky enough to spin up a portfolio company that scaled from Minnesota to New York and DC. And then took one more turn to work on the plan side and spent many years inside of one of the larger Blue Cross plans and got to wear several leadership hats there. But maybe kind of most relevant to this conversation and the work I'm doing today was I had oversight for a portfolio of 28 digital health products that we would bring to our members, that we brought to our self-insured employers. And through that, I was lucky enough to see what is good, what works, what data is important, what engages a patient, or in the health plan world, the member, what has meaning to the provider and to the health plan. And then with all of that experience, I had the opportunity to go out on my own, start my own consulting practice where I was advising young companies and CEOs and founders across really the entire healthcare continuum. And my pitch, Sean, was to say, I could speak a lot of languages for you. I could speak provider, I could speak health system, I can speak device, I could speak venture, I could speak insurance. And was lucky enough then to be contacted by the team from OneStep. They were a consulting customer of mine. And after working with them for 6 months, when they asked if I'd like to join the team, I said, if I was ever to wind down my consulting practice, say three must-haves. One, you got to have a really good product, service, technology. So check. And again, we'll talk more about it. Two, you got to be really good people. And these are wonderful people to work with. And three, there has to be a reasonable likelihood of success, starting with we're helping patients and providers. So check, check, check. So I wound down my consulting practice and about 4 years ago joined the OneStep team in my current role as Chief Commercial Officer at OneStep. So that was a long answer to your question about my journey, but I think maybe
Very
just
good.
helpful context.
Like you said, to have had your foot in so many different aspects that O&P touches, I think that's just
Yeah.
a wealth of experience there you bring. So with OneStep, what was the gap in patient care or mobility assessment that led to the creation of OneStep? What problem is OneStep trying to solve?
Yeah. So maybe we'll geek out clinically just for a minute here. I'll put on my physical therapist hat. So we've known for years that mobility is such an important indicator of health. And we've talked about for years, gait and gait speed are the sixth vital sign. And there's this deep body of scientific literature, Shawn, that notes this. So if your gait speed drops below 0.8 meters per second, your risk of hospital admission goes up 10%, your mortality risk goes up 12%, your cardiometabolic risk goes up, your cognitive decline risk goes up, your fall risk goes up 8-10%. And that's just with one little parameter, some 0.1 meter per second. So we've known that there is this important vital sign, but the challenge has always been, how do I measure it? We've seen so much innovation in other vital signs with no touch thermometers to be able to measure temperature, ambient sensors, heart rate. We can do Bluetooth scales where patients and providers get to see data in the patient or resident's or member's own home. But how we measure somebody's mobility outside of a clinical setting has really been a challenge, and that presents a gap. It's a pretty significant gap in terms of clinical knowledge. It's a significant gap in understanding how a device or a prosthetic works. And frankly, it's a gap in care. So we've known for a long time that, Shawn, if you're my patient, I could watch you, and this is pretty universal to all providers, not just PT, but certainly to our P&O colleagues. Watching how somebody moves as they walk across the parking lot to come into our clinic is oftentimes substantially different than how they move when they're in the clinic with us. And the ability to understand how somebody is truly functioning in their natural environment through mobility measurements is really important. So that was the gap that the OneStep co-founders really understood. Strong vital signs, strong scientific literature. How do we measure a vital sign outside of a clinical setting? So that's what we solve for at OneStep. And we've had some pretty significant impact on health, on quality, on cost, and on reimbursement for our provider partners.
So for someone who's never seen a OneStep before, how does it work? What does a patient have to do? What does a clinician have to do? What's measuring? Is it sensors in my smartphone or is there an add-on piece of hardware?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the team has been able to turn any smartphone. So we're platform agnostic, whether it's Android, iOS. Most of the listeners, I think, are probably aware. Most modern smartphones, and this is anything from 2013, 2014 on, have very sophisticated motion sensors built in. And we see that every day when we're looking at our Maps app or whatever it is. If we turn our phone even 10 degrees in any direction, the map will adjust for that. So these motion sensors are built in. So what we do at OneStep is leverage the power of these motion sensors. And then simply by dropping a phone in a pocket or a pouch and walking as few as 10 steps, we are able to complete a full gait analysis. So we're capturing more than 30 standardized gold standard gait parameters, temporal parameters, spatial parameters. Again, we'll geek out clinically here in a moment. A range of motion in the hip, in the sagittal plane and the transverse plane, just with a phone in a pocket. So one of the historic barriers to being able to capture mobility data has been cost and hardware. you know, cameras that somebody needs to stand in front of or that a clinician needs to spend time picking up and putting in front of a patient. Or from a patient asking them when you are home, take this strap, put it around here, attach this. We know that there is an adherence curve in healthcare, and there's a bit of a cool factor for maybe the first 2 weeks of any new tech. But anytime we're asking our patients to do yet another thing, we see that the compliance or adherence to a program goes down. So we've solved for that by using smartphones, being able to use the device that nearly every one of our patients and providers already have to capture clinical grade medical data is a game changer. So we're just from a logistics perspective, OneStep is we're a class 2 FDA medical device. All of the data we're capturing, we've published 15 peer-reviewed papers, so providers and patients can feel very confident that the data they're getting is real and legit. There's a strong IP moat around what we're doing with 13 patents because, again, we wanted to make sure there's no friction. So the patient never needs to calibrate this. It is simply downloading the app, phone in a pocket, taking a walk, and we get the data. So that's what we're doing at OneStep.
So it sounds like with the data you're collecting, the gait, the symmetry of the gait, speed, balance. So when you're collecting that, it seems like it's not only for amputees, but even people with a limb difference or who've had any kind of limb preservation, salvage surgery to measure gait post, maybe even a minor amputation versus a major amputation.
You're absolutely right. And maybe just describe a couple of the use cases. So certainly people with limb loss. We know one of the challenges that providers have is on the prosthetic side is I can observationally watch my patient with their initial prosthetic, and as they move to their permanent prosthetic, I can see how they're doing. I get what the patient is telling me, but I may be missing some very subtle but important mobility or gait parameters. So we're helping our prosthetic providers real time dial in an ideal or an optimal prosthetic fit. We'll say for a moment in say a clinical setting. So Shawn, you're my patient. We've just fit you with a prosthetic. Take a walk. So I, as your clinician, have OneStep on, say, an inexpensive Android that's in a clinic. Take a walk. I immediately get 30 gait parameters: symmetry, asymmetry, step length, stride length, base width, range of motion, all of this data. And then I could go in and say, all right, based on this, I'm going to adjust the pylon length, or I'm going to change the toe angle. I'm just making up some adjustments. And then take a walk again. So you can tell me it feels better. And now I have the objective data that said, oh, indeed, it's better. Your step length is much more symmetrical. Your stride length looks better, or your balance is better. Your sway is better. So it's that real time data. And then I'd say, Shawn, now this looks pretty good. I want to see how you're doing in your natural environment. So let's get OneStep on your own phone, take it home with you. And anytime you're walking, OneStep will run in the background. We will passively run. So if you take 10 steps, if you walk however far you want to go, we will get clinical grade gait data. So now I, as your provider, can see here's how you're really functioning in the real world. Where it gets even more interesting is, in addition to the gait and the mobility data, I can then see what's happening between visits. So it may be you're coming back, and again, I'm making it up. It may be 3 weeks before I'm scheduled to see you again. Well, at a week and a half, I noticed there's been a change. So I can proactively reach out. Hey, Shawn, I noticed something. Are you okay? Should we bring you back in? Let's make sure you don't have any skin breakdown, whatever it may be. So we're measuring the vital sign passively in your natural environment. And from the provider side, in addition to the mobility data, we can capture some of the standardized measures. A sit to stand, a timed up and go, a 6-minute walk with now a true endurance score. So not only how far did you go in 6 minutes, but at 1 minute and 14 seconds is when you sort of fell off the endurance cliff. We saw all sorts of changes. So now I've got an idea as your provider that, okay, I see how far you're going, but what's the quality and the endurance of your ambulation along the way? So an awful lot of real data happening in a clinical setting as well as in the home setting or in the natural environment.
And it seems that the data there that processes is getting in the clinical setting now is much more than they had available before. Like in the case you used where you're making an adjustment to a patient, you have patient says it feels better, but then you have the data to say, okay, this is the result of it feeling better. And so they have that kind of data. And then you were talking about the data that the clinician can see in between visits when the patient's not even present. So what does
Mhm.
the clinician see when they look at OneStep? Are they seeing graphs and charts and metrics? Are they seeing raw data? What do they see through the app?
Yeah. That's an important question because what we've known for years is clinicians and providers, not just on the prosthetic and orthotic side, but just at large, they don't necessarily need more data. They need data that is insightful, helpful, and actionable. So just throwing a spreadsheet with this range of motion or these parameters doesn't really lead to action. It doesn't lead to provider engagement because we know we've got workforce issues. We know we have productivity concerns just based upon the economics of healthcare in general. So what the provider is able to see is a few things. One, Shawn, you're my patient. You've taken a 10-step walk. The first thing I see is an aggregate score. We call it a walk score. So 0 to 100, and it's there for a few reasons. One, it drives your engagement as a patient. We just got some new data from one of our medical device partners. Nearly 50,000 of their patients that have hip and knee replacements are being measured and monitored already just since October with OneStep. So we're seeing that those patients are going in to look at their own data 6.05 times per week. So they find that score very engaging. And it's a positive, it's a feed forward mechanism. Hey, since you've been on this device, we see that you're moving in the right direction. Keep going. Your team is doing great work. Keep going. Your exercises are paying off. Your assistive device is helping. And then from the provider side, that's not a clinical decision tool, but it's kind of a trend line. Shawn's getting better. Shawn's getting worse. She's moving in the right or the wrong direction. Then from the provider side, we provide very easy to read red, yellow, green graphs based on age and gender adjusted norms and population norms. So the provider can see, yep, Shawn has her walk score has improved. Good, something right is happening. Now, what's informing that? Well, her speed has improved, her stride length, step length, symmetries, asymmetries, these have all improved. So make it very easy for the provider to see what has gotten better or what has gotten worse. What are the areas of focus? So very, very provider friendly because we know providers just need the quick at a glance red, yellow, green.
I love how you're taking all of that data and you're compiling it all, using the metrics and the benchmarks and what you know, and turning that into actionable information that the clinician can
Yeah,
use.
very important. Back in the days in the health system, we saw so many innovative ideas coming to us, and we said, all good ideas go to the bedside to die. Because if a provider doesn't see value, if it's not easy, it just doesn't get used. And we know that's even more important now, again, with the workforce issues that we mentioned before.
Do you have a use case for us that would show how OneStep has been used with a patient to actually change their care or improve their care?
Yeah, so many. So just for context, from a one-step perspective, we now have more than 250,000 patients on the platform, and we're capturing more than 2 million gait cycles every day. And we've got about 35 billion gait cycles in our database. So there's an awful lot of power and some really impressive stories from the clinical value we're providing, the economic value, and the operating value. In, say, our senior living communities, we're in about 500 plus senior living communities. Our partners are using OneStep because we can identify the fall before the fall occurs. So they've seen falls come down 23, 25%. We know that's a huge issue in the limb loss, the P&O population. Falls are certainly high. So OneStep being able to help identify the fall risk proactively helps both the patient and the provider intervene. But back to your question on kind of a specific use case. We had one case in particular. A prosthetist was working with somebody who, if I remember correctly, had a transtibial amputation. Observationally, the prosthetist said, you look pretty good. And the patient kept saying, it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right. And it was a bit of kind of the prosthetist pulling their hair out just to figure it out. They used OneStep and identified 3 gait parameters that revealed where the discomfort for the patient was coming from. There was a step length difference, there was a timing difference, and there was a base width in it, how far apart the feet were spread. Using that data, the prosthetist substituted out the foot component of the device, put on a new one, That patient said, I feel so much better. The prosthetist initially said, I don't really understand why you feel better, because the components in the prosthetist eyes were fairly similar. But what they were able to see was take a walk. They saw we cleared those three really important asymmetries. And then they used that data and that report to go back to the payer and say, this is why we're using this other component, which I believe was a bit more expensive. And the payer said, okay, good. We understand it. It's not just subjective. Here's the objective data that demonstrates why this person responded well. We need sort of the justification for the higher K level as well. So that's one that, it happened about a year and a half ago, Shawn. And again, there are many more, but that's one that just always stuck in my mind because it helped serve the patient who said they feel better. The patient saw their own data. The patient had increased confidence and trust in their provider. The provider had the data they needed to get paid and actually brought that feedback to the manufacturer and said, wow, look at this. Here's the objective data that showed your device indeed had significant improvement. So it was kind of a win-win for all.
It's a great story. So with tools like OneStep integrating broader efforts into registries, what do you think about that as far as integrating this data with registries, integrating remote monitoring and registries and value-based care? What does this all look like when you bring it together?
I think back to, Shawn, you were gracious enough to invite me into one of your groups at one of the national prosthetic and orthotic meetings. And it was so interesting to hear the members of the registry talking about the data that's important to them. And I don't know if you recall, we had the big sticky notes up on the walls and we were asking questions, what data is good, what's working. And it was so interesting to hear the providers universally saying patient-reported outcome data is great. The EMR data is great, all the comorbidities. But what we don't know is how they're truly functioning. We don't understand their mobility outside of the clinic. So if we could add objective gait and mobility data into both our practice and the registry, we now have the three-legged stool. We've got the EMR data, we've got the patient-reported outcomes, and now we have the objective data. And if we just re-reference that patient story I just talked about, we have global medical device partners that are using OneStep to truly demonstrate the true value of their implant, their brace, their stimulation, whatever the intervention is, because they know their device works, they know their clinical trials work, they know that their FDA listing is all good, but there's that gap between what the patient is telling us and what's truly happening in their natural environment. And it's been very interesting, Shawn, just in the last few years at large conferences, say 2 years ago, I'd say the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons meeting, when we could talk with surgeons or device companies about a functional mobility intelligence layer. 2 years ago, the conversation was, I don't quite get what you're talking about. Even just as recently as last month, that conversation has changed. The device companies and the surgeons are saying, yes, this makes sense. I need this data, and my insurance companies are demanding it. They're demanding more functional outcome data. So all that being said, I truly believe that from the prosthetic and orthotic space, adding objective data about function and mobility will become a very, very important part of documentation and reimbursement. And I think the registry is so uniquely positioned to be that data collection layer because you already got the EMR data, you've got the patient-reported outcome data. So the systems are built to then add in objective data to help really round this out.
So is it safe to say this will become a standard of care for mobility tracking or just collecting this objective data? Or do you think we're already there, that this is the new standard of care?
Well, if we want to sit up really straight and feel good about the work we're doing at OneStep, we feel as though we've created a category and we're having a very positive impact. I mentioned in senior living, we're working in health systems across the country, medical device partners, payers, and risk-bearing entities are now coming to us. And in fact, consumer technology is coming to us as this idea of mobility as a biosensor to understand movement, behavior, general health. We hope we continue to make this vital sign as accessible and as easy as stepping on a bathroom scale to become the standard of care that will help inform coverage decisions, payment, reimbursement, regulatory, and frankly, to help drive enhancements to the great work that's already been done in the prosthetic and orthotic space.
With all this said, what's one thing that you think it's important for clinicians, whether they're surgeons, prosthetists, any practitioner, what's important for people to understand about how real world mobility data is collected outside the clinic, and how important that is to patient care?
I think what providers, what I hope they would take away from this is we're not reinventing the science about the importance of mobility. That's well established. Thousands of articles about gait and mobility with all the connections into oncology, cardiometabolic, all the things we talked about early. What will begin to change or is changing as we speak is as providers and payers enter into new payment models. We've talked about value-based payment for years and years and years, and is it really coming? Yes, it's happening. And so the providers and the device companies that will win in value-based payment models or bundled payments are those that can most effectively wrap their arms around their patients, from a clinical setting to their home environment, to proactively intervene before the higher cost event occurs. And we've been able to measure heart rate and temperature and blood pressure and weight in the patient's natural environment, the classic vital signs. Now we have the ability to measure and monitor this vital sign. And if we can do that, it's another really important layer to help providers become even more successful in these quickly emerging payment models.
Very important. So, in closing, what do you think the future of O&P looks like in 15 years? And we have all this data now and all these new apps. So what does this all look like in 15 years? And what role do you think data sharing and the registry have in getting us there?
Well, I'm really excited about if we could fast forward to 15 years from now, because the access to medical grade data is so pervasive. And providers are quickly becoming more and more savvy and understanding and want to use data to help improve the care they're delivering, drive efficiencies in their clinical models, demonstrate the impact of their interventions, whether they're prosthetics or orthotics or medications or exercise or assistive devices or implants. I'm very excited about the direction that I see the prosthetic and orthotic space moving. And certainly, things are continuing to move fast. There's still work to do to continue to drive engagement from the providers to look at data. I think to be honest enough with data that sometimes may reveal things that we don't want to know. Gosh, I thought this looked like this, but here's what the data is showing me. So I think we need to have a little bit of humility in how we're looking at data and let data help inform practice. Certainly never to replace, but to help inform and enhance what we're delivering. With that as my personal sort of bullish and excitement on it, the registry, Shawn, I think it's at the center of this, specifically in the P&O space, because the registry has done so much good work to establish so many of the really hard components. The data you have is so powerful. And I believe that the payers, the regulators are very hungry and interested in using data to help inform new payment models, quality standards, expectations of providers. I just see so many areas of complementary activity between what we're able to capture in the real world, how that informs the great work that you and the registry team have already done. And ultimately, it can enhance patient care, which is what we're all here to do in the first place.
Well, thank you. And it did take a pretty large team to build the registry. A lot of experts and a lot of doctors and researchers who all contributed into that and still do
Right.
today. to your point about seeing things that you weren't expecting in the data, we are seeing that in the registry data already. We see a lot of things that we expected to see, but then sometimes there's that one data point. It's like, well, that's very different than what we expected. So you continue to mine the data and learn more. And it's going to be a never ending process of mining the data to continue to learn more. And like you said, inform clinical practice and inform patients. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, Shawn, thanks again for the opportunity. Thanks for your collaboration and partnership, and we look forward to continuing to work together.
Thank you for joining us on Data That Moves Us. Whether you're a clinician, researcher, patient advocate, or other expert, your voice and your experience matter. Stay connected with us on social media through LinkedIn and Instagram. Together, we're building the evidence that drives better outcomes. To learn more about the Limb Loss and Preservation Registry and how to join, visit our website at llpr.org and become part of the movement.